We're here to talk about a poem by Gwendolyn Brooks called Truth. Truth is spelled with a lowercase t. And I'm really sorry we don't have a recording of Gwen Brooks reading this poem. I don't know that one exists, but she is such a fine reader of her poems. I won't do it any justice, but lacking the audio, I thought I would read it, and then we'll talk about it. Truth. And if sun comes, how shall we greet him? Shall we not dread him? Shall we not fear him after so lengthy a session with shade? Though we have wept for him, though we have prayed all through the night years, what if we wake one shimmering morning to hear the fierce hammering of his firm knuckles hard on the door? Shall we not shudder? Shall we not flee into the shelter, the dear, thick shelter of the familiar, propitious haze? Sweet is it to sleep in the coolness of snug unawareness. The dark hangs heavily over the eyes. Okay, Anna, if a seventh grader comes to you and says, what's this poem about? What's the simplest thing you could say about what it's about? I know we don't do a lot of about here, but what's it about?
I think it's about the sun.
Okay. The sun at what time of day?
Early morning.
Early morning. Okay. Kristen, what has happened prior to the sun coming up?
Everyone was sleeping in cool, snug beds.
Mm-hmm.
And they are, it's been a long time of sleep, night years.
Yeah, why does she use night years? That's such a... What happens at that point in the poem? Up until then, you think, oh, this is about the morning and it's not complicated. Why does night years potentially change everything?
To me, that's where it took on symbolic significance. She seems to be creating sort of a conventional opposition between the blissful ignorance of night, which is prolonged over a long period of time. It's not just about the sun coming up, and the sun potentially symbolizes truth or some confrontation.
So you really want to go symbolic, or you recognize that symbolism is possible?
It seemed to be a sign of symbolism. Yes.
Okay. What I want to do is I want to go around and ask everyone very briefly to say what night years is or does. Just throw something out on the table. So Dave, Poplar, what does not, it's the morning, the sun's coming up, and we've prayed and we've wept for him, the sun, all through the night years. What's happened in those night years, and what does it make you think?
Like Maurice, I read this symbolically, and to me, night years is really about self-deception and complacency.
Okay. Jason, night years?
Well, when I read it, I heard light years, but I think it's a time of great darkness that has seemed to go on for so long that one has become used to it.
That's cool. Is there a tradition, Steve, I'm going to put you on the spot, is there a tradition in poetry and or music where we've been through a long night and now the day comes? Are you familiar with that tradition?
Sure. Let's see. I mean, it comes up in the blues.
The blues, yeah. And can you just riff a little bit on, I'm not asking you to sing the blues or even to quote the blues, but what's the typical sentiment of the long night?
Well, it's a relief. It's the long night is some negative period, perhaps a depression, perhaps some
a binge.
Right, certainly a binge, and then the following day is generally positive. Not in the case of this poem, or not entirely, but the day is the thing we look forward to.
Max and Anna, have you ever had a long night and the sun comes up and you're really not ready for it? You don't have to be personal about this, but is Brooks talking about a common feeling, Max?
Yeah, absolutely. I think sometimes, that's the effect of the night, and the effect of sleep is that this strange, at once contraction and expansion of time, like when you're falling in and out of a dream, in and out of sleep.
So actually, to our consciousness, night can be forever. If you've been doing a lot and stayed up late and then slept, you're very disoriented. So night years doesn't need to be symbolic. It could actually be her way of describing the night. Anna, your thought on this?
Yeah, I just think sometimes if you're like, maybe you're really stressed out and it just seems like this is just like never ending. And then it finally ends and you don't know what to do with yourself.
Okay, Allie, your turn. We're still on night years. We have wept for him and prayed. That does suggest a symbolic reading. Are you willing to go there?
Yeah.
Who or what might the son be?
Well, I mean, it's called truth. So,
Small t, though.
but still, I can't help but think of tell all the truth, but tell it slant.
Yeah.
And
There is something Dickinsonian about the stanza, slightly, but go ahead.
and you know, even if it is the sun, it's illuminating something else. And that might be too bright or too sudden or too painful.
Okay, that's cool. You did a really good sort of literary close reading of it, but Kristen, I'll shift to you then. Can there be a precise symbol that can be drawn from this poem?
I don't think it's a precise symbol. I think it's a multitude of symbols, actually.
Can we at least acknowledge that in the tradition of Christian iconography, that the sun and the Son of God
Yeah,
are
I mean, if you take
often
the
a pun?
sun, S-U-N, pun, then it's Christ.
And the sun rising. What else? We have the praying. Is there any other potential?
The knocking on the door.
Let's talk about the knocking on the door. I mean, for me, going back to Max's hangover. Oh, did we say there was a hangover, Max? I'm sorry, I'm outing you. When Max has been carousing all night, binging, I think was the word that Steve and I used, and the morning comes, right? And it's fierce hammering. Wake up! It's daytime, Max. Come on, get it together. Is that possible, Kristen? That it's simply the hammering? I mean, it really is kind of frightening. Knuckles hard on the door.
I mean,
how could that be Christian?
Like Judgment Day.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, there's a specific image of, gee whiz, I wish I had the source. It may be Acts of the Apostles, but it's a metaphorical story that you need to let Christ into your own heart. That is to say, there's a door on you with no knob. Christ will knock. You can either open or not.
That's beautiful. All right. So, Lily, are you tempted to... Is it okay for you if this is not a poem of Christian symbolism? And if it is not, then what is it?
it's okay for me, although I think that the word prayed makes it a little bit harder to ignore that reading. But I still think that we can take sun a little more literally, and especially if we think about sort of what Max was alluding to earlier about the blinding coming of morning, and especially just that like blinding, you're not ready for it, but it's coming anyway aspect.
That's cool. Emily, I'm going to read you the stanza that begins, "Shall we not shudder?" and ask you to say something about it. Shall we not shudder? This is after the sun has shown up and banged on the door. Shall we not shudder? Shall we not flee into the shelter, the dear, thick shelter, odd phrase, of the familiar, propitious haze? Ooh, I made a rhyme there by my mention of odd phrase, and then we get haze. There's no rhyme, I just made it. But what haze is this, and what's the shelter, and what's going on?
Well, the reading that I tended towards was Allie's reading, as it being it's sort of a vision of tell the truth but tell it slant. And the slantedness might be the haze, that sort of hazy ignorance.
What's the opposite of haze?
Clarity.
Clarity. So theoretically, following Steve's summoning of the blues tradition, theoretically, the long night, dark night of the soul, which is not just a blues tradition, but is in fact a Christian autobiography tradition, a Moll Flanders tradition, a Pilgrim's Progress tradition, where you go through the long night and then you emerge into the clarity and the sun. And the sun becomes Brooks's way of tapping into that literary history and that Christian iconographic history and allowing us to go into clarity, and the poem itself is remarkably clear. And yet, suddenly, she asks the question, shall we not flee into this haze? Should we not do it? What does that mean for you?
Should we or should we not?
Yeah, what's she asking?
If we're ready, in a sense, for the truth, perhaps, or for some sort of Christ-like figure, some sort of capital T truth.
Where would she come down, Amaris, on the side of whether success in circuit lies? tell all the truth, but tell it slant. Is this a slanted truth, this Brooks poem?
I mean, for me, at the end of it, it was difficult to see if she was advocating for this direct confrontation with truth. So I would say that she would agree with Dickinson that it should be circuited. Probably that's where the title comes into significance, the fact that it's not capitalized and that she begins with a question and that she does not begin with a condition, but rather a conjunction, to me was significant of sort of an attitude of openness, but at the end it's still dwelling in darkness, but yet a darkness that's going to go somewhere.
Nice. Jason, snug unawareness. Sweet is it to sleep in the coolness, and that coolness summons the shelter. I sense like it's just too hot out there in the clear sun, and it's just so much better to sleep in.
Yeah, well, I would say that in addition to the Christ imagery, or the idea of, there's the idea of kind of salvation or some sort of end of the world. But I think that we want to swing around the Mediterranean to maybe Athens and get a little bit of the allegory of the cave in there as well.
This would be Plato.
Yes, Plato's cave, in which there are people who are seeing illusions and taking them for real. And when they go outside, that actually the truth of existence is so blinding that it is actually painful, and that there's desire to, so not only, so truth and freedom suddenly granted becomes gratefully a burden, the burden of freedom, or the shock of truth. Might be harder to face than what one has become habituated to.
So Lily, where does Brooks stand? Does she have a position here on whether we should accept the hard hammering of the sun and get up and face the light? That would be the more conventional sentiment, and that may be the sentiment here. Or is she saying, shall we not, in fact, not go into that sun?
I think that Amaris mentioned the starting of the poem with a conjunction, and I also noticed that, and I thought that the whole poem had a sense that the poem itself was weighing the options. Like, she might not have decided herself at the beginning what she felt our attitude should be, and in fact, maybe our attitude about this sort of coming of a new order, or the coming of the sun, or whatever, should perhaps be that it won't be easy, and we can read it critically. We don't have to just accept it coming towards us.
Good. So I'm going to invite everybody and anybody 2 more rounds. The first round I'm going to set it up a little by talking about Etheridge Knight's response. Not that we'll get into that, because there's a poem talk about that. But I want to sort of summon the idea that he had and see if that changes your view of the poem. And then I want to go around and ask everyone the question I posed to Anna at the beginning, and to Anna too, which is, now that we've talked about it, what in sum would you say to a neophyte reader this poem is about? And if you want, when we go around for that, you can add a point about whether this poem connects to the lessons we've learned about modernism, or about the slanted truth, or any of that stuff. So make it a Modpo poem or not. Okay, so Etheridge Knight wrote a response to this poem in which he essentially argued that the sun did come. Not if it comes, but it did, and it was Malcolm X. And he came and we blew it. We didn't see that he was the guy, the sun, that needed to take us out into the bright sunshine. Now, Etheridge Knight and Malcolm X shared the biographical fact of having been imprisoned for quite a while. Malcolm X for a different kind of misbehavior than Knight. But the point is that they shared this idea that coming out from the Knight years was like coming out of prison and coming into the light for Knight of poetry. And for Malcolm X, into the light of what he perceived as a clear set of principles, just to put it neutrally. So Knight is essentially saying to Brooks, not if, but when, and when it came we weren't ready. And why weren't we ready? And this is Knight talking to this is Etheridge Knight in the Harlem Renaissance tradition, largely thought of, responding to Brooks, who had sustained the tradition of the kind of poetry that Sterling Brown or Langston Hughes would write. So in this line, if we want to force that line to be a line, we have Knight rebuking his beloved elder, saying the sun came and we weren't ready. And in a way, kind of, sort of accusing her of, though he was very polite to her, accusing her of being of the generation of people who would write about how maybe we shouldn't be ready. Maybe we should stay in the dark. So I just want your thought on that, not so much on the night. Now, that's a Knight, not the night years. So what's your thinking now about what this poem does? Is she urging us out into the light, and does it have anything to do with poetry and poetics as we've understood it? What a difficult question. But you can go anywhere you want, as usual, with it. I'll start with Max, who seems ready. Listeners to this audio don't know how ready Max looks.
I look very ready, I'm
okay.
sure.
Tell us quickly where we are now.
I think it's she does want us to come out into the light. I think she is saying that ultimately that is what she's advocating. But at the same time, it is such a complicated poem, and the fact that the sun is embodied, the sun is given a gender, the sun has firm knuckles, and there's this fierce hammering. You get the sense that this truth, this thing that we shouldn't just be turning away from, this thing that we've longed for, is still going to come and hunt us down. There's something ominous and threatening about it.
Good. Thank you. Kristen?
Yeah, I definitely agree with what Max is saying here. I think that what Brooks is talking about in this poem is that she does want us to open our eyes and get away from the dark, but she's saying that it's really going to be hard, and it's going to be painful.
The dark hangs heavily over the eyes. We're not really ready, but we should be.
Yeah, I think it's a painful truth that people need to be awakened to.
Allie, your thought? I'm sorry, Kristen. Finish your thought.
I was just saying, I think it's a painful truth that is hard to wake up to, and that it's easier to stay in.
Okay, Allie?
Yeah, I agree. And not to kind of criticize Etheridge Knight's kind of critique of the poem, but I think it's probably a lot easier to make that critique in retrospect when you're saying, oh, well, this happened and we missed it.
Mm-hmm. It's possible that Knight, I was involved in that poem talk discussion, and I don't know if it came up, I can't remember, but it's possible that Knight was reading this poem as about Christ and sort of extending the tradition of Christ's return and the end of night to someone like Malcolm X, which is a kind of daring revolutionary thing to do. Anyway, you were saying.
Yeah, and I mean, if you're going along that kind of religious line, then what do you do if you've missed it? Are you going to wait for a second Messiah, or are you going to wait for something? Or are you going to start the painful process of unshielding your eyes, collectively?
And what is valuable, Lily, about Brooks's approach, to the extent that it's Dickinsonian, it's really not participating in a definite symbolization, symbolic history, or even it really is about daily waking, in a way, in a Dickinsonian way. This is what we do every day when I'm kind of getting the chills saying this, every night is the night years, and get it just I'm thinking of the reason I'm getting the chills is I'm thinking of Primo Levi, who wrote about his experience in the Holocaust, waking up every morning at Auschwitz, putting your feet on the floor and opening up the blisters one more time. It took an act of incredible courage to crawl out from the snugness and the coolness. I'm making it sound more urgent than it is, but I do think it's urgent. I think she is saying this is the hardest thing we do every day, is to meet the sun. Lily?
I do think that there's an urgency here. For me, the two lines that I've been thinking about are, though we have wept for him, though we have prayed. I think first of all, weeping and praying, those convey a very emotional response, but also a sort of attempt to define emotion or soothe ourselves. And she's saying, though we wept and though we prayed, though we did those things to prepare, we're still not going to be prepared. And though we did those things to describe for ourselves what we thought we wanted or what we think we're getting, it might not fit those expectations. It might just blind those expectations away from us.
Well put. Emily, your thought?
Yeah, I think this poem is less interested in giving some sort of imperative to look at the light, whatever that may be, as to an imperative to look at ourselves, that even if the sublime, and whatever type of sublime, sort of Christ-like, just sort of more general and nebulous than that, it doesn't matter if it's accessible if we don't know how to apprehend it.
Nicely said. Maurice?
So I agree with Lily and Emily, and I was thinking that she's saying this is sort of showing how society needs a coaxing into consciousness, that even when truth arrives, it's usually encountered with some sort of measure of resistance. And because there is this ominous quality that Max was talking about, the poem is very calming and soothing, the way that Lily was saying. And even if we dismiss the religious undertones and allusions that we could possibly make, it still has this sort of hymnal quality with the repetition in the anaphora of like thou, though, and shall, and of the sweet as it. So I think it is encouraging, but in a very sort of gentle, coaxing sense.
Classic Brooks. Dave?
The line that means the most to me is, shall we not flee into the shelter? Because that creates a feeling of running away from the truth. Because to me, it sounds like she's advocating you have to look at the truth, but it's just so comfortable to live in this self-deception that we have. And the way she even describes the propitious haze, the snug unawareness, it's really comfortable. You want to stay in that self-deception, but really, you really shouldn't.
Cool. Steve?
I think the most terrifying I think the most terrifying thing about this is that there will be more truths to come, right? You get to the end, sweet it is, to sleep in the coolness of snug. Oops, that's not the line I'm looking for. The dark hangs heavily over the eyes. When the scales fall from your eyes, there are more scales behind them. And so this may be, she's dwelling in anxiety here. And I don't think that she is necessarily pushing the reader into the light. And that's really what makes it such a striking and singular and good poem.
Nice. You're all hot here. Jason?
Yeah, and I think that what's beautiful about the poem that maybe is that the response to it as an inadequately revolutionary call to arms is the tone in which it asks these questions. Instead of saying, we shall not shudder, we shall not flee. The answer to the question seems to be an implicit, of course we shall shudder, and of course we shall flee. And almost the poem working like an inoculation to acknowledge in advance and kind of comfort the fear that will inevitably come when the chance to act or face truth or light comes. It's almost like it is a comforting embrace and an acknowledging our own frailty in the face of challenge, but in order to not pretend that we don't flinch, but after we flinch, we shouldn't feel bad about it, but continue on.
That's beautiful. Listening to you do this makes me want to take your course. If you do that, typically. Anna, what I want to do is start with you and go all the way around, and I'm going to ask a very hard question because we've already spent a lot of time doing this, so I'm going to ask everybody to be brief. Is there a phrase, a word, or a sentence that finally the answer to that seventh grader or the answer to the neophyte who's not read a lot of poetry, what this poem is about? I'm going to start with you. I'm going to give you a second to think about it before we do it because I want to try something that I've not done so far in Mod Po. I've not done this. I've not delivered at the 11th hour an interpretation that nobody has mentioned yet. And I also don't typically do this with an historical reading as I'm about to do. So I just want to put this out there. I don't think it's the final word. I'm not suggesting that. It just occurred to me, and I just want to say it. So while you're thinking of the phrase or word, I'm going to throw you guys way off by doing a very specific reading. Published in a book in 1949. The image, the most existential anxiety of that time, of course, was what happens when the Soviet Union gets the bomb, the A-bomb, as it was called. And of course, the image that scared most of us was the film newsreels of the fireball of the A-bomb, which was essentially called, it was often called an artificial sun or a second sun. This was a time of tremendous anxiety everywhere. And we have a reference to the shelter, the dear thick shelter. We have a reference to, the whole problem is how are we going to deal with this when it happens, or if it happens. So I don't think I buy the reading necessarily, but I do buy it as much as any other referential meaning. I think I much prefer my Brooks to be the Brooks that I love, to be telling me about waking up in the morning every day. But it's the only way I can think of shelter. So shall we not dread him? Shall we reckon with what we've done to make this particular sun rise? It would be a whole lot better to just go into the shelter and ignore it. And there were all kinds of ideological views as to whether it was a good thing to have shelters in the first place. Because if you had shelters, it was a way of suggesting that you could survive this self-destruction when you couldn't. Anyway, that's a really unusual, not Filreisian thing to do, because I don't really like readings like that, but I just couldn't help myself. Okay, so ignore that, jury, and let's go around and say a phrase or a word about what this is about. Anna, you're up. What's it about?
I still think it's about the sun, and I do, and I connected with your reference to Primo Levi and just like, how hard it is for people every day, like no matter how like where you are in your life, it's like.
There it is. It's a common fact. Okay, Max, word or phrase?
I just want to say real quick that I really like that nuclear reading, even though I don't think that it's substantiated entirely. I mean, in the poem itself, you did a great job, Al. I think.
Thanks, Max.
Gold star.
That means a lot.
No, I think that
fierce hammering. Oh my goodness.
Yeah, it's really terrifying.
The end has come. Yeah.
And reckoning with the fact that we've managed to create the means for our own complete annihilation. I think is
and that
pretty
it's
terrifying.
like the sun, that it resembles the sun.
But I'm gonna cop out and go with a phrase that sticks with our earlier reading, and one that definitely doesn't do justice to the idea of total war and nuclear apocalypse. It's not easy.
Yeah, it's not easy. That's so nicely put. It took a while for you to get to that phrase, but it was a good one. Allie, word or phrase? What's it about?
I want to say, no matter what, you have to go on.
Yeah.
Because I don't know. Even the kind of question format of the poem. You can kind of be uncertain as you want to, but day will come, and nice. I don't know. You kind of go into that automatic mode where like you'll keep walking even if you don't know what you're even if you don't know why. So
good. I think we're 3 for 3 on that because that's a version of what Anna and Max said as well.
Yeah, and
Kristen?
I'm going to agree with all of them and say that I think that this is about awaking from the dark night of the soul and the blues meaning of that, and that it's about choosing to live in this world and to be awoken by the sun.
You know what they say, maybe Steve, who seems to be the blues man today, if you want to sing the blues, what do you have to do?
You have to have the blues. You have to experience them.
Yeah,
that's what I hear.
The line from David Bromberg, who's singing a traditional song when he made this famous, is "You've got to suffer if you want to sing the blues." And there's a certain amount of walking directly into suffering in order to have that experience. Lily, word or phrase?
For me, the phrase that I think of is the last stanza of the poem, in the tense of the darkness. The dark hangs heavily over the eyes, and I feel like this poem is not just about what everyone else has said about, like, choosing to face something that's coming, but also the fact that the choice is near, like soon we're going to have to make a choice. So I think everything else in the poem is set up as like a future tense, what if, but finally we end with the darkness does hang heavily over the eyes, like it's coming soon.
Good observation about tense. Emily.
Yeah, I think this poem is about preparation, about readying ourselves for all that is or could be terrifying in life, whether that be salvation or the apocalypse, as you suggested.
Maurice.
Following our discussion about the historical context, I centered down on the phrase propitious haze, and propitious has connotations of timeliness. So to me, that just sort of indicates that sometimes people aren't ready at a certain time for a certain truth, but following Dickinson's slantedness, gradually with time, that truth can become acceptable.
Great. Dave.
I love the phrase, the dear thick shelter. I think she's saying, listen, I know it's easy to walk around life with your head down. I know it's easy, I know it's comfortable, but you're not going to see anything that way.
Great. Steve McLaughlin.
I'm going to go with the night years myself. Seems like the clear turning point or access point of the poem. And I like the doubleness of the night that could be years, but also potentially having the blues for years, which is familiar to some people.
I share with you I love the middle of the poem there. I think that's great. Jason.
I like the session with shade, just because I like how it sounds. And I think I go with Max and
that really is good after so lengthy a session, which does sort of summon up the blues, doesn't it?
Sure does.
Like a performance.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not easy to stop singing the blues.
Yeah, that's great. Well, you've all gotten a final word, and Anna's sticking with Sun. Right, Anna?
Oh, yeah.
All right. Well, it's good to see you all, and I think maybe we've created an interest in this poem, which is a poem that needs more attention. So thank you very much.